everyone. Welcome back to the Adventures Less Traveled podcast. Let me ask you a question. Have you ever taken a wrong turn and driven into a dangerous neighborhood? You didn't have any data, you knew nothing about the area, all you knew is at that moment, you should not have been there. You didn't stop to think, why is this area dangerous, or how could I have made such a stupid mistake? No, you're hopped up on adrenaline. The only thing you're thinking is, how the hell do I get back to safety? This is known as the fight or flight phenomenon in psychology. And this internal foreboding, this sixth sense of fear and apprehension, is not just reserved for everyday situations like careless driving. In an adventure context, knowing how to act on these instincts could be the difference between life or death. This is just one of many aspects about human nature that's studied in psychology. And a great deal of psychological research extends to all aspects of human nature, whether it's child psychology, social psychology, sports psychology, but surprisingly absent from this list is adventure psychology. Today, I have Dr. Eric Brymer joining me for the second of a two-part series on the psychology of adventure. Eric is a researcher at both Southern Cross University in Australia, as well as the Manna Institute, which is a rural and regional research facility focused on the link between mental health and the environment. Additionally, Eric is the primary co-author of Adventure Psychology Going Knowingly into the Unknown, with Paula Reed, who we found out last time has some pretty wild adventures of her own, and 19 other co-authors spanning 9 countries. Given Eric's academic background and research experience, I look forward to hearing his perspective about this very nascent field and what we can all learn about adventure through the lens of psychology. So with that being said, Eric, thank you so much for coming on the show and joining me today.
You're very welcome.
Now, for those who might not have watched the last installment with Paula or are simply unaware, what is adventure psychology?
How long have you got? So essentially what we're looking at, I mean, in the past, probably a way to explore what adventure psychology is to start with a bit of a history. In the past, psychology has in many ways, in many areas, borrowed off other areas. So sport and exercise psychology, for sake of example, borrowed off educational, clinical. And then eventually people realize that actually there's something very different about sport and exercise that doesn't fit nicely under educational or clinical or notions. And in fact, it's a very different thing because we're looking at how to help people perform effectively in short period of time. So something similar is happening in adventure and has done over the last decade or so. And we're now looking at rather than trying to think about how theoretical frameworks in other areas might be applied in adventure, we're moving into how the specific psychology or psychological elements of adventure itself, and how they can be applied to everyday life. So from that perspective, adventure psychology is a very much emerging field, and we're in early days of trying to understand what it is about adventure that is unique, that is special, so that we can help adventurers, but also utilize this adventure, the psychology of adventure, to help people in everyday lives. My first sort of real sort of thought about adventure psychology was way back in 2002, 2003 during my PhD, where I was looking at extreme sports and realized that there was something very, very different when we're looking at people who are doing extreme adventures as compared to sport, which was probably the nearest cousin, but also as compared to business and as compared to other sort of psychologies that were supposedly performance oriented. And that's really piqued my interest. And then of course, later on, we realized that the implications of that are that the psychological theories that we currently rely on in other areas are no longer appropriate, or maybe maybe a better word is they're limited in terms of trying to understand adventure or trying to understand how adventure can help people in everyday lives.
Yeah, it's as if you guys are trying to build a framework, like you said, to cement it as a standalone area. Now, the crux of research is being able to collect data, test your own hypotheses with that data, and then to the greatest extent possible, try to reproduce the results. Now, this is a particularly interesting field, even more so than, say, adventure sports, because the margin for error is so small. There's no type 1 error. The type 1 error is you die. So what do you think are kind of the necessary ingredients to really demonstrate this field as a reproducible area of research, as something that can output results in that sense?
So I think that one way to look at that is to sort of think carefully about what in adventure might be different than the everyday psychology, or in particular than its its closest cousins. So if we look at sport and exercise psychology, for sake of example, most often a sport and exercise athlete will do, or a sport athlete will do lots of training for a 1 hour, 2 hour, whatever it might be, competitive event. You're looking at competing against other people. You're looking at the idea of winning and losing. You're looking at how to handle momentary or maybe an hour long. So a lot of the psychological techniques and a lot of the understanding of psychology in that context wouldn't fit an adventure scenario. So if you're looking at multi-day adventures, let's say, or even multi-week, or even multi-months, or you're looking at an activity where you mess up, it's not a matter of the ball has not gone in the basket, or I've lost that game. It's a matter of, well, that could be my life goal. When you're looking at something like that, you realize that actually some of the really important techniques in sport and psychology, which are used well, etc., such, it don't really apply. You can't really shelve emotions for weeks or even months, or even bracket them or put them in a box, which you might be able to do for an hour-long competition or a couple of hour-long competition, because you don't really have the luxury, if you like, of going home after the competition, and because you're still out in that context, you can't really the rules and regulations and external environment, all those necessary things that come into adventure, which I'm sure we'll talk about later. They aren't the same. We don't have a very constrained, you put your foot over that line in adventure, then you're out. Okay, the adventure is over. No, it doesn't work like that. You don't have an understanding of what the rules are. The rules aren't something that somebody else has come up with, or regulations are externally administered. They're things that happen. So it means that from a participant's perspective, the requirements for adventure, the psychological requirements, how we understand adventure, becomes something very, very different. One of the main ones, of course, is that interaction with the natural world. That's a major element of adventure, which is not in any other area in psychology, but is potentially, arguably, fundamental to what adventure is all about. And that changes psychology, because psychology is no longer in the head necessarily. It becomes somewhere in between the head and the environment, is that relational notion. It's sort of, and how effectively we are attuned to information in the natural world becomes something really, really important. It's less important to be attuned to something like that if you're playing basketball or if you're playing football. Yes, there are environmental notions because you're playing against another team, but those environmental notions are very, very different.
And to what you were saying earlier, it's in the sport context, it's shorter, right? And if you're playing an American football game and it's snowing, yeah, you have to deal with that for an hour, but that's a totally different context than skiing across Antarctica or something like that, right? So it's interesting when you say the adventure doesn't just end as soon as you get back, right? That was kind of there's a whole chapter on like the narrative of like the hero's journey and how it's like the transformation of the individual, right? They go through the adversity. There is kind of that start and finish, but once they cross the physical finish line, it's all about how they've evolved as a person and what they've learned and grown as. So it would be interesting to look at like longitudinal studies of, a certain cohort of people who've done whatever the activity may be, whether it's mountaineering or polar exploration, and looking at how that has interplayed into the dynamics of the psychology of it too,
I think that idea is quite challenging. And the reason it's quite challenging, which is one of the reasons why adventure psychology in itself is quite challenging, is because when does the adventure start? For many people, the adventure starts way back when you're a child, and you're the one that really loves climbing trees or rolling in the mud, or you're the one that loves to sort of experiment with, how you can build a bridge over a creek, and then that builds and builds. For some people, they might be involved in that, but then life changes and they go into traditional sport. For other people, It doesn't work like that. That sort of movement or that interest moves into, let's go and try scouts or kayaking or something like that. So it's very hard to determine, which is why some of the psychology, some of the sort of genetic personality and all those theoretical frameworks don't work so well, because we don't yet know whether adventure tweaks people's personality or way of seeing the world, and therefore what we're measuring on a snapshot is not so much, oh, these people, the traditional kind of sensation-seeking, risk-taking, these people must like adventure, or if you're a risk-taker, you like adventure, because we don't actually know whether they started off that way or whether adventure moved in that way. Plus, of course, we're finding that actually there isn't anything along those lines. Adventurers come from all backgrounds. Adventurers have all sorts of personalities. The other element to that is that we have to be very clear, even with the adventurous events, let's say. So you might have done 20 years of worth of training, and you're hoping that along that journey, one of the things you will achieve is, I don't know, climbing Everest, let's say. We have to be quite careful where that particular event starts and finishes. For most people, metaphorically, it starts at the beginning, at the bottom, and ends at the top. But actually, for adventurers, it doesn't. It ends back down again. You've got to get back down. So with a sporting context, the top is the achievement. Oh, I've done it. That's it. Fantastic. I've achieved my thing. Oh, that's the end of it. But we don't have helicopters to bring us down from Everest. That's not where it ends. So where it ends is not like a tennis match. Yes, I've done it. No, you've got to come back down again now. And not only have you got to come back down, but you've got to come back down in quite dangerous conditions. You've got to come back down and, with a sense of well-being, the end of it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you've got to be more than just alive. And we all know that actually where most accident happens is likely in that stage where people are coming down from having that sort of initial stage. So we have to be careful what we see as the adventurous journey. The adventurous journey isn't achieving the summit. It's getting back down safely from the summit. And that isn't something that we, that we see much in a sporting context, let's say. Thirdly, there's a really interesting, phenomenon going on here. When we look at translating something like sport and exercise psychology, let's say, into everyday or business contexts, because sport is about achievement, it's about all these sort of things. Actually, we're missing the point. Sport is very much about focusing towards, as we've already said, short-term events. Life doesn't have focusing towards short-term events. Neither does business. Business isn't a practice now, compete, practice now, compete. Business, you're competing, if you like, all the time, or at least you're performing all the time. So then that's when we start to realize that adventure psychology is probably more appropriately and more accurately a metaphor for everyday life or for business environments and so forth than some of the traditional understandings of how we might use psychology that might come from sport, exercise, or some of the performance area. So there's multiple contexts within that, which I think are fascinating. Not only because it means that we have to understand psychology different, and our psychological theories have to be very, very specific to the adventure context, but also the implications of adventure. What adventure might be, what we understand about an adventurous event in terms of an adventurer's journey, and all those kind of things, where the way things are mixed up. Hence, narratives and people coming away or starting to saying how much they've changed and transformed. Absolutely, that happens all the time. Sometimes that can be because they built up towards an event, and that event has been tough, hard, or it's been run perfectly as it is, and they've come away a slightly different person. Sometimes it can be because of that gradual process of becoming more and more adventurous, and the more you get to know yourself. But what we're not saying here, though, is that everybody who does an adventure therefore is a fantastic person. No, some people do go to adventures because they want to prove themselves, because they want to compete against the mountain, because they want to compete against the wave. But it's like the old metaphor: just because a dog has 4 legs and a tail doesn't mean everything with 4 legs and a tail is a dog. And just because some people may have sensation-seeking personalities, or may want to do it for competitive purposes, or may want to do it, that doesn't necessarily define adventure. And in particular, it doesn't necessarily define adventure psychology.
And even those in that example where they do it for the competitive reason, it might be the fact that 5 years later or 10 years later, they look back and they realize, like, wow, look how much I've grown because of that So then they start to change their framework from a competitive mindset to an adventure mindset.
Yeah, yeah, very much so. What we found in these more extreme adventurers are that people get into it for all sorts of reasons. And for some people, it might be because they've seen a video and they love that heavy rock music and it looks really competitive and cool, man, and all those kind of, extreme dude, etc. Some people might do it for that. But what we found very, very, is that people very quickly change, because if they carry on with that attitude and they don't have the commitment, they don't get to know themselves, they don't have those changes, they don't put the training in and all those other things, then either they're going to die or they're going to be very seriously hurt if they're lucky. And so then we either have people that drop out very quickly because they have picked it up when they're a teenager and they have done it because of all those reasons, or even when a young adult, and that's why they've been doing it, and they aren't prepared to put the energy and effort into it, or they change and then they start to be a little bit more serious and they start to realize that actually there's a little bit more work to it. One of the downsides, I think, over the years, it's a plus and a downside, but what we now have also is the equipment that we utilize makes it much easier to do certain things that we couldn't have done in the old days. For sake of example, mine is whitewater kayaking. If you take a modern kayak down a grade 4 now, you can bounce off whatever you like, and the likelihood is you'll get down the other end without much of an issue. If you did it when I started with the fiberglass boats, the first thing you hit, your boat would have had a hole in it. And then all of a sudden, that's it. You've got a boat with a hole on and you're in a grade 4 and everything's going a little bit. So we do have the possibility for people to pick it up for all sorts of reasons. But in order to sustain it, in order to keep it going, and some of the people, I've been working with are in their 60s and 70s, in order to keep it going that long, it's a lot more than the fact they've got a boat that can bounce off things. It's a very, very different scenario. And most often what keeps people going is this sense of development, sense of having a better understanding of yourself, but also that attunement with information, that attunement to the environment, that sort of sense of being part of the environment that comes with it.
So for the Manna Institute, what are some concrete directions that you try to test out, or like what is some of the research that goes on there specifically to what you were just mentioning?
There's a number of things that are going on. One is we're looking at how adventure can enhance mental health, and this might be lower levels of adventure. We know from a lot of research now that well-managed adventurous activities, and I'll say from the very beginning, there are some very seriously badly managed adventurous activities that are utilized in this context. So I'm not saying everything, but well-managed and well-designed adventurous activities have enormous positive impact for all sorts of mental health issues, from serious complex traumas to to less serious issues. So it can manage the not well and bring people up to a point of being okay. But more than that, it's the same kind of activity can bring people from being okay up to the sense of flourishing and thriving. Some of the research we've been doing, for sake of example, shows that people who do the required amount of physical activity per week, but do it in nature-based adventurous activities, are far more likely to be in the flourishing and thriving group than people who do the required amount of physical activity, but might do it in a traditional sporting or a gym or something like that kind of context. So the activities themselves are quite powerful interventions for all sorts of mental health and also physical health issues.
Why do we think that is?
Yeah, there's two elements to it.
Sure.
One element is the interaction and the immersion in the natural environment. So the natural environment is really, really important, and that's a research area. The other area is the adventure itself. So those two combine. Well, the third area, of course, is you being physically active. So physical activity itself is good for mental health and well-being. You do it in an adventurous context, it adds a little bit more to it. You do an adventurous context in nature-based environments, you add even more to it. So therefore, the kind of adventure we're talking about is really the epitome of, if you want to go along that continuum, it's the best version to do, to get the sort of benefits you get, because you've got physical activity involved, which has been researched for a long time. We know the benefits because they're adventure, and we know that the impact of adventure could everything be from the realization that you can do something you didn't think you could, or learning how to do something that was tough, in a way that is translatable into everyday life. And then also because you do it in the natural world, and we know that the natural world itself has enormously powerful impacts on mental health, whether you're doing physical activity or not. But you put all those three together, and you got something pretty powerful.
Sure. In the book, you mention a lot of future directions that it can go. What do you think is kind of the most paramount next step or next direction for where your research in particular, but also like the field as a whole? Like where does it go from here?
Yeah, I think, I suppose in a nutshell, it's integrating adventurous experience into everyday life. At the moment, it's something that is a nice to have. Hey, let's try it. But as soon as something gets a little bit struggly or something goes, it's the first thing that goes. And that's because people don't really understand how important and how powerful adventure is across the lifespan. So if we could find a way of integrating this, and we're looking at adventure, we're not telling everybody has to go and climb Everest or surf a big wave or whatever. There's a whole range of adventurous activities that can happen. But if you are able to integrate well-designed adventurous activities, whether that's a forest school kind of adventurous activity, whether that's a Scouts, or whether it's a Duke of Edinburgh, or whatever it might be, but if those kind of adventurous activities, that journey, where people have the opportunity to be physically active in adventurous context in the natural world, and you create it in such a way, like they do in Scandinavia, if you like, where it is culturally part of everyday life, and the systems in place allow that to happen, so that there is no, it's almost like there is an expectation, or there is a cultural realization that adventure starts, and it's just part of your social kind of building blocks, if you like, and it carries on across the lifespan. That, I think, is the most essential thing for it to happen. That way, that will impact on the way we design our local environments. It'll impact on how we see play areas. It'll impact on what we do in schools. It'll impact on how we think from a public health perspective. It'll impact on the kind of ways that we use physical activity for people's health and well-being. I mean, in the UK, they did some research some time ago that showed that actually the greatest increase in physical activity things is outdoor adventurous activities, people going kayaking or bushwalking or mountain walking or whatever it might be. And because people want it, but we don't yet. At the moment, if you go to if you look at political or social social kind of traditional ways of looking at things, if you want to get people moving, what do you do? Well, you say play more sport. But if we had adventure, because of all the benefits it brings, integrated, then I think it'd be far more powerful. Far more powerful for many reasons. One, it's essentially deep play. Sport is too highly regulated. Rules are and rules have this kind of way. Oh, you got it right because, hey, you've done something that relates to the rules. If it doesn't relate to the rules, then it isn't right. Adventure doesn't have that, except for Stay Alive, maybe. It's the competitive element of adventure. Unless, of course, you're starting to move adventure into the sporting notion, you start having competitive climbing and things. But mostly adventure, in the way we look at it, is not competitive. It's not about trying to beat somebody else or trying to whatever. It's about trying to see what you're capable of and improve yourself and develop. So you've got something that has all the really powerful benefits that the society requires, but for some reason we still haven't integrated within society, or some parts of the world don't. Some parts of the world do exceptionally well. Traditionally, of course, adventure was what was called life. Wandering through the bush and wondering whether you're going to be a saber-toothed tiger, etc. That was life. Now we call it an adventure. Some parts of the world, you're still driving a moped with a fridge and 5 members of your family, whatever. In other parts of the world, that will be looked on as whatever. Other parts of the world, it's still very much seen as, society is integrated with the natural world, and going out and being in nature, doing what we call outdoor adventurous activities is what we should be doing across the world.
Yeah, it's an interesting point you bring up, particularly with more of like the subtle, from a policy standpoint, right? Like, how can we, without being too intrusive or creating too many rules, like you said, like how can we implement something that's subtle but still encourages people en masse to partake in adventures? And it's, the most basic example would be like, more parks lead to more people going outside, right? But in where I am in the U.S., in North Carolina, there's it's called the Whitewater Center, and it's all about like they have whitewater rafting, kayaking, zip lining, bungee jumping, rock climbing, like all sorts of really, really fun fairly risky, activities that people can partake in, and like just having that in the area attracts thousands and thousands of people. But then you look at the greater North Carolina atmosphere, and it's a very adventure driven state in the U.S. So it is interesting how those kinds of like what you're saying, like how can we encourage people in a moderated dose of adventure, like how can we encourage people to go out and be active in that kind of sense. It's important to take risk, not unregulated risk. I think one of the intro stories in one of the chapters actually talks about, I'm blanking on his name, but he, it was like how he was a racer and he wanted to do all these really, high adrenaline activities, and people thought he was reckless. And he's like, it's not reckless. I know exactly the risks I'm taking, and they're very calculated decisions, so it's all about kind of having that. It speaks to the subtitle of the book, right? Going knowingly into the unknown. I think that's one of the most important parts.
Yeah. I think we have to be quite careful with the. I mean, I totally agree with him, but I think one of the things we have to be quite careful with in adventure is the idea of risk.
Right.
Not because, not because necessarily it's a bad word, but what we do not want to do is have adventure and risk seen as the same thing, because they're not.
Right. Yeah, and spoil it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Risk is I have no clue what I'm doing. Risk is kind of playing chicken running across the road. And your risk is gambling, because there really is adventure isn't that. Adventure is, and this is where the environmental element comes, because people think that risk is all to do with the activity in the environment, and how can I push myself? But actually most adventurers, including extreme adventurers, spend a lot of time training, getting the skills required. So I remember talking to a really high-level adventurer who's done really incredible things, and he said his attitude towards risk was that, well, it's more risky for me to drive on the road than it is for me to do the things I do. And he's done some incredible things, walked across Australia, kayaked across, done Everest type things. He said more risky for me to drive on the road than it is to do the things that I do. The reason being is because I have the skills required to do it effectively. I do an enormous amount of planning and preparation. I understand the environment that I'm in, and I can read it really, really well. Whereas if I'm on the road, I have no clue whether that person come towards me is texting, is drunk.
Right.
I don't know anything along those lines. I have no sort of no knowledge of this, no information, no skills to do that sort of things, and I don't know what's going on. I can't look at somebody and say, hey, that person's drunk. At 200 meters away, I better move to the side. But I can look at a polar bear and think, maybe I shouldn't be where I am right now. I think I'll move away from this thing. Or I can look at the sky and think, oh, it looks like it's going to storm, so maybe I need to. Or I can do all these sort of things. Or I can look at a slope and think, well, that looks like it might avalanche. I won't go that way. I'll go this way. But when you're on the road, you can't do that kind of stuff. So risk.
It's almost like it's almost like a locus of control thing.
Yeah, it's sort of it. It sort of is. But the other side of the coin is that actually people. This is where it becomes really fascinating adventure psychology. And as I said at the beginning, it's emerging because, yes, from a sport and exercise psychology perspective, locus of control would be the first place you go to. And it is to an extent. However, people who do high-level adventures say, well, actually, you can't control. All you can do is everything you possibly can to kind of make the best effort of it's going well, but you can't control the environment. So it's almost like do what you can, then surrender. And you're then in a position where you've done the training, you've got the skills, you understand the environment, all those sort of things that you need to do it really, really well. But if something happens, you're not in control of it. All you're able to do is be prepared and properly prepared so that the chance of things going wrong are minimized. But you can't control the environment.
Right. Yeah. And I think it's an important, it's interesting because humans generally don't understand probability. They have a hard time rationalizing, probabilistic behavior, right? So like if you say 1 out of 100 chance of something happening versus 99 out of 100 chance of something not happening, it's all about the context and the connotation of how you say it, right? So it's an interesting point you bring up about the word risk, like the connotation associated with risk, where, from say like a poker player might, there's a huge difference between a 20% chance and a 15% chance. But for someone just saying that person's reckless, it's like it's a hard thing to quantify at certain times. So I think it's really important, like you said, to emphasize the minimizing the risk and what is taking the route that is in one's control to the greatest extent possible,
Yeah. Yeah. And also, it's one thing to risk when you're going to lose a few $100s or a few $100,000.
Yeah, right.
It's another thing to risk when actually the outcome is you're dead.
Right.
So that's where the kind of idea of death wishes and the idea of those sort of things, because people didn't understand, well, if you're going to do that, you must be risking your life. Well, that's not the case at all. I mean, that's why the notions of risk and all those sort of things are quite dangerous if we're not careful, because the people we need to persuade to take what we do seriously don't get the difference between adventure and risk. And they're the ones that we need to communicate with. We need to understand very carefully how to use our language so people understand that actually this isn't about risk. Risk, it isn't about, well, if I make the wrong move, then I've lost $2. Or if I do this, then I've got a dent in my car. This is, if I make the mistake, then I'm dead. Or potentially I'm dead. Or at least I'm seriously in a bad situation. So risk, the connotation of risk is, therefore, they're deliberately doing that in order to risk their lives. Therefore, they must have a death wish. Or if they're not, then they can't have any fear, because why would you put yourself in that position and still have fear? We know from research that none of those are accurate. So I think the way forward, which is why I say integration is the biggest thing for me, is that we need to think very carefully about how we use this language, because the people that we need to persuade don't understand. Either they're business people and see risk as what they're doing. Well, we've got to do something that says, hey, we're going to make a little bit more money, in which case they've missed the point. Or they're people that are adverse from it. It's rare to have somebody in a position that can alter policy that actually may have come from an adventurous background, that actually understands it more, that says, yeah, I get what you're saying. So that's really the point. It's not so much, yeah, well, anyway, I'll leave it at that, because that's really what we need to be quite careful about, I think, if we are going to try and get adventure integrated.
Yeah, no, it's really I think the book does a great job of highlighting. It's a very, very thought-provoking book. So I'm going to shamelessly plug it here. It's because there's so many nuances to adventure. And I think the one thing that is pretty apparent from the book is there's not really a universal definition of adventure, right? So someone who's lived in New York City their entire life, who goes to Mount Everest, that for them, that might be their adventure. But a Sherpa who lives in Nepal their entire life, who goes to New York City, crossing the street might be an adventure. And it also speaks to what you're saying, how it's not necessarily a start and a finish, right? It's the transformation. It's what happens before, what happens after, all the training, everything that goes into it. So it's a really interesting take. Now, you specifically have two sections, I believe, on the fear and on the success and the failure. It's
success and failure is Eric. We did one on the ecological approach and the fear approach. So that's
okay.
Yeah. No, that's okay. That's fine.
It's two Erics. But
yes,
those two topics in particular are very interesting because they're so intertwined in many ways, but it's also fear is the one point that you bring up in the book is that fear can be a very, very good thing, and it can be a life-saving, innate, I don't know if you'd call it an emotion or what the technical term is for it, but it's a really interesting concept because that, just like adventure, takes so many different forms. And there's so many ways that fear is such an integral part of what adventure is that I think you bring up a lot of really interesting points. And so I guess my question is, of everything that goes into an adventure, what is the best way that fear should be approached from a proactive, like a training standpoint? Because every adventure is inevitably going to have some aspect of fear, right? So how should people approach that concept?
In terms of developing skills to become an effective adventurer, there are sort of three really important elements. And fear is part of one of them. One of them is, and my argument has almost been that this is probably the most important, is effective attunement to information in the environment. So often when we learn adventure, we learn the skills and techniques to move a craft or to tie ropes or whatever it might be. But actually, in many ways, the most important skill we need to develop is how effectively we attune to information in the environment. Fantastic, you can tie a rope or you can move a kayak around. But if you don't understand what the environment's telling you, then that doesn't stop you, doesn't help you in terms of when things might go wrong. If you don't understand that the rock you're about to get on actually is going to collapse, doesn't matter how good you are with the knots, the rock's going to collapse. So to me, one of the most important things is is helping people attune to information in the environment. That's directly related to the idea of fear. Because one of the ideas of, if you look at that from that perspective, is the more effectively we tune to information in the environment, the more effectively we understand that environment. Fear then becomes a channel, if you like, or in some way that we're kind of a little bit, we're not 100% clear on whether it's a channel or information itself. But essentially, what we're saying is that something is not right here. My environment, I'm attuned so well into the environment. My body is telling me that something is not right. And instead of making that as something that is run away quickly, that means I've got to pay real attention to this because, and so therefore fear becomes something that says, pay attention, becomes something that actually is a really positive aspect of what it becomes something that keeps you alive. And, people in the past, often say, well, sometimes we don't even know what it is until we see it, but we know, we can feel it. The second part of it is the task. So that's the environment. And the second part is the task. And yes, the skills required to undertake the activity are absolutely essential. Yes, it is essential to be able to tie ropes effectively. It is essential to be able to place wherever it might be. It is essential to be able to utilize skis, kayak, etc. Totally it is. But those skills without the capacity to read the environment, they don't go well. But having that skill, having those skills tuned so well that you can perform in those environments is really important. The third element is you as the performer, the human being doing the work, and that is the knowledge of yourself. So if you aren't able to read yourself and you don't recognize the feelings you're having, or you choose to ignore something like fear, or you choose to do this no fear, that let's do it anyway kind of idea, then that's when things can go wrong, because you're sort of missing the point of why you have that experience, that feeling. It's not a sense of anxiety or worry. It's a sense of real world, something is up that I need to pay attention to. But if you haven't got if you haven't grown well enough inside and these experiences, feelings come up, you'll miss that. So there's three elements to that. So I would say if you are going to train with a fear element, one of the first things to do is to help people read the environment really, really well, so that they can understand that what the environment's saying, and they get that trim. The second one is to reframe this experience that you're having, not as something to run away from, as something to fight, or as something to conquer, but as information that is, or at least giving you the sense that you need to look out into the world for something, because there is something your body is telling you. And of course, eventually to develop the skills, you might need to do that. The individual thing gives us one more little element to it, and that means that psychology is no longer in the head. And that in itself, adventure brings out more than any other psychology. Although sport and exercise psychology does do it, psychology is now in the body, but not just in the body. It's in the relationship between the body and the environment. So your experiences are very much embodied, and that embodied experience comes from that relationship. So all of a sudden, psychology is a lot bigger than something that goes on inside the brain or inside the head.
Yeah, and it almost seems like the secret sauce to all that is the exposure, right? So if there has to be some kind of happy medium between how much exposure one has to those elements, but to a limit, right? Because if someone who's been a total house hermit their entire life, they never stepped out of their house, and they get this huge inspiration to do some mountaineering adventure or something like that. Like you're saying, they can't just jump right in with this whole no fear element. There has to be training and preparation and so forth. And so it seems like starting out with small exposure to adventure is advantageous. But then once you get like to the opposite extreme, when you have people who are skydivers and everything, and there's a part in the book where it mentions overexposure to extremely dangerous or harsh environments has an increased likelihood of death. So what is kind of that happy medium, and like how does exposure play into those three elements?
I think the key is one size doesn't fit all. And I think we've got into a bit of a pattern at the moment that assuming one size does fit all. So when we start introducing people to adventure, we have 20 people and we say, this is how you use a kayak, or this is what we're going to do. And we all do exactly the same thing. We don't, it's very unlikely that we figure out, even in adventure-based learning, it's very unlikely if you spend some time before the adventurous experience to get to know the individuals, to find out a little bit about them, to understand a little bit more about what might be adventurous for them, so that we can tailor what we do and make sure that it's appropriate for everybody. And it's very unlikely that we go after the event. No, they just turn up in a bus. We get them all off the bus. We say, right, we're going off to go and do this. And they go back on the bus and they go home. So I think the key is we have to understand that one size does not fit all. And actually you might get, and we've seen that in the past, where we have an actor who decides they want to climb Everest. So they go off into a gym and they become very, very fit by doing the stair thing. They get all that stuff done. They do a bit of training, and then some guide or something like that sort of basically stays with them all the way till they get to the top of Everest, or almost as far as they can go and come back down again. But that's how Everest, the Everest tourism thing almost survives, if you like, is because people with a moderate amount of skill, moderate, in some cases, excellent skill, of course. I'm not saying everybody like that, but there are quite a few people with moderate levels of skill who, if you like, are guided up and guided down. And then we get, of course, the other side of the coin. People go up there and back down again without oxygen on their own solo, blink of an eye. So the key to that is one size does not fit all. The second key to that means that in terms of, let's say, the notion of exposure, we have to have different ways of understanding. We have to think about that differently. One person could get a really good knowledge of environmental, how to read the environment, and be able to interpret that and translate that into other contexts relatively quickly. Somebody else could struggle even to notice certain things in the environment, and so therefore their capacity to move on. What we need is all those three keys: the activity, the environmental, and the individual aspect in balance. Once they're out of balance, i.e. the environmental exposure is too great because of their technical skills, because of their individual understanding, then once one of those things is out of balance, that's when things don't work so well. So we need to get all those three things in balance. The other thing, of course, is that depending on what kind of adventure we do, walking is a relatively everyday thing for most of us. Walking in a particular context makes it a little bit different. With a backpack on makes it a bit different. With the intention of sleeping overnight makes it a bit different, and so forth. So exposure is definitely part of it, but it has to be balanced, and it has to be done in a way that suits the individual participant, rather than assuming that this is the irrelevant exposure you should be going at your stage of whatever it might be.
Sure. Now, tangential to that, are there certain types of adventures or certain adventure environments that are more conducive to growth and learning, or is it like, I guess, is it kind of an across the board thing, or is it just like the last question where it's kind of an individual component?
Across the board thing, everybody will benefit from adventure, but what we need to be careful of is what adventure means to each individual. So in Melbourne now, they built a playground which is basically made of rocks, or it looks like it's made of rocks. And instead of, the trouble with the traditional playground, for sake of example, is there's maybe one or maybe two things you can do on each of those ones. You can slide down something, or you can climb up it. If you have a more natural environment, there's multiple things you can do. And there's no dictation, even the social kind of mores of how you should use this piece of equipment, because it's just, you can pick up a stick and whack it, you can climb a tree, you can hang off it, you can fall off it, you can do whatever you like. So by creating environments that allow people to see the environment in a different way, and therefore to experiment, is really important. That's why things like parkour and things like that are really, really interesting. Not just because of the movement that comes from it, but also because they allow people to see the environment, their everyday environment, in very different ways. Socially, we have the stairs and the banister that says, step up these things and hold the banister. Parkour says, well, why don't you slide down the banister or jump up the wall? You don't have to use the steps. But we have been socialized into seeing how we move, even through our urban environments, in particular ways. So part of it is educating people towards other ways of moving and other ways of seeing the environment. Secondly, is then to give people the skills, and that's psychological as well as technical skills, to move through that environment in that particular way. So even in urban environments, adventure can happen. We've just got to get through the cultural kind of restrictions, if you like, that mean if you did climb a tree, if you're walking down the middle of a city somewhere, before long you'd have the council there saying you shouldn't be climbing up that tree, somebody might fall out and hurt themselves and when they get sued. Actually, maybe we should be encouraging people and kids to climb trees, and actually the families that are allowing their kids to do that have got it right. But we need a lot of big societal change to make that happen.
That's a that's a great example with the parkour. I never thought of it like that, but I guess it really is just the perspective that you look at it, right? Now, in a related but totally different area, the success failure idea, right? So there's an entirely different area of fear, which is like fear of failure, fear of just letting people down, and that's a totally different kind of fear that is not necessarily the environment itself, but it's more of like, I guess almost societal, or like how
it's a social environment.
Social. Yeah. So how do those two kind of interplay with one another?
Yeah, that is very, very interesting. And I don't think we probably know the full answer to that one yet. I think we're in a position of saying we need to find out more of that one. But very much the social environment acts very similar to the physical environment. And for some people, especially if you're caught in, it's very challenging depending where you get from. But if you imagine you're a sponsored athlete, and the only way you put food on the table or get your mortgage paid or whatever is that you do these particular activities. But I can remember speaking to one extreme kayaking adventurer many years ago, and he when he first started, he said it was I was almost doing things that I thought that I shouldn't have been doing because the money, the sponsorship, and all the rest of it. And that was a sort of social I don't want to let people down, or people have just spent 6 hours preparing for this one shot, and the last thing I want to do. And he said he was lucky to get away with his life quite a few times, really lucky, because he didn't listen to himself, because he didn't think, actually, you know what, I'll do this tomorrow, because of all these sort of things. He said, but gradually, I was able to work more effectively with them, and we would do a thing of making sure that everything was right before we set up. So yes, that is definitely there. And depending on the context and the individuals, of course, that will have a slightly different impact. The other element of fear, of course, is the element of fear of this feels right to me, but I have a family, or what am I, and I used to get asked that question a lot in conferences in the early days. And the way I tried to describe it often was, well, it's almost like adventure for many serious adventures is almost like it's part of them, it's part of their body. So would you ask your significant other to remove their arm and in order to, to fit in socially? And it's massively uncomfortable for those that are on the sides, for those who are not adventurers, but have somebody who's an adventurer in their family. And that's often why, adventurous behavior in young people is stopped, because people get a little bit, I'm not sure about this, I don't know, maybe they shouldn't do it, etc. Right down to, of course, we get sued. We're struggling with that at the moment, I think, as many societies across the world. But I'll move back to the point earlier on. Once upon a time, what we now call adventure was called life. And we've lost that. So somehow we have to bring it back. Somehow it has to be integrated with our social kind of structures again. Somehow we have to see adventure as absolutely essential to effective human development. And because of its potential impact of all sorts of different health, educational, social kind of things, somehow we have to get all that back. And the adventure psychology notion is really, I suppose, a start of that. Or not a start because it's been going on adventure education and all those other areas as well, but another way of bringing it together to hopefully understand it more and utilize that understanding within broader society.
Sure. I think that's an excellent proclamation to end this on. But before we go, I want to ask you, how do you personally define adventure?
For me, it's about, as I said earlier on, it's about being in. For me personally, it's about being in natural environments and in ways that whatever you're doing in that natural environment is essential to that experience. Now, that could be gardening, but for me, it is more likely to be kayaking, mountain biking, or something along those lines. And then we get continuum adventure, of course. We get those that are adventurous at one end and right to the far end. So to me, it's that integration of the person environment. It's about growth. It's about change information. It's about having the skills to participate at that level.
Cool. Well, that's about a wrap. I think this was very informative to hear your perspective on more of the academic angle, how we can go from here, and I'm excited to watch this field grow. So thanks so much for coming on the show, and thanks everyone. We'll catch you next time.